let's discuss, therefore, what is a tissue. So let's define, first of all, tissue. Okay? Who'd like to share with the class what is your definition, or in your own words, what is a tissue? Miguel? A lot of cells. Well, the human body would be a lot of cells, but we're not just a tissue. Okay, anybody else? Christopher? You're close, but anyone else?
Group of functioning and structurally related similar cells.
Very good. A group of cells. A group of structurally and functionally related similar cells. So in shorter terms, a group of similar cells with some common role. Right? A group of similar cells, and that's what you saw here with some of these slides today, right? Well, for instance, you saw there a tissue from perhaps an organ of a fish, where you saw there a group of similar cells. Now, of course, each of the cells were in different phases of mitosis. That doesn't matter, though. They were all similar. So a group of similar related cells is what we refer to as a tissue. If you just say a group of cells, that is not necessarily a tissue, because the human body is a group of cells, but different type of cells, right? So you got to be a little bit more careful. A group of similar and related cells with a common role. Now that we've understood more closely what a tissue is, what is the main instrument that is used to study tissues called? The main instrument that we use to study tissues? Microscopes. That's why I told you to leave the microscopes there, because we'll be using them again to look at different examples of tissues. Now, we do have there on your tables there, there's a couple of trays, and each tray will have varieties of tissues and organs, right? So that you can observe and appreciate what different tissues look like fatty tissue, like blood is a type of tissue, or epithelial tissues, muscular tissue, bone tissue, whatever. So all those are examples of tissues, and you have those on the trays on your tables. Okay, so we'll do that later on. But first, let's now take a look at tissues more closely. And when we look at tissues, when we study tissues, tissues will consist, first of all, because of what we said in part of the definition, that's a group of similar cells, then all tissues must consist of cells, right? Cells, some type of cell or cells, and also extracellular material called the matrix. Extracellular matrix. In books, they will abbreviate it as ECM. Okay? Extracellular matrix, this is the material that surrounds the cells. So when you look at cells, for instance, here's a group of cells. Maybe cartilage cells or whatever. You'll see that there's a lot of extracellular material that surrounds and bathes the cells. Right here, extracellular material. Okay? So that, two parts that tissues will have. Now, some tissues will have very little extracellular material. Others will have a lot more, like this. Okay, so that varies. But in tissues, you will have cells and this extracellular material. What is the extracellular material, by the way? What is it made of? The extracellular matrix consists of two things. First of all, it consists of a substance called the ground substance. The ground substance. Okay, so ground substance, what is the ground substance? It varies from tissue to tissue. In some ground substances, the ground substances may be more fluid-like, like in blood. In other examples, the ground substances may be more solid, like bone. Okay, for instance, if these were blood cells, right, this ground substance of the extracellular material would be more fluid-like. But if it was bone, the ground substance here would be more hard, like mineralized because of the minerals that it has, such as in bone. Or in other cases, might be more gel-like, like in cartilage. A more gel-like type of ground substance. But the ground substance, besides consisting of this material, a material with lots of solids in it, okay, will also contain, the extracellular material will also contain protein fibers. Fibers. Okay? So here, if I drew some fibers, okay? So that's what the extracellular material consists of. Some type of substance of different varieties, fluid, gel-like, or solid, with fibers in it. There is though only one exception of a tissue that has no fibers. But it will have an extracellular matrix with a fluid-like ground substance. That's the example known as blood. It doesn't have fibers. If it had fibers, your blood would clog and wouldn't flow nicely through your arteries and veins. But most other tissues will have some type of ground substance that contains, some type of extracellular matrix that contains fibers. So those are the two components there of the extracellular matrix. So now let's take a look at my different types of tissues. And we have in adults, in the human body, we will have four main types of tissues. One type of tissue will be, number one, epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue. Okay? Let me just list here very quickly the four main types, the four basic main types of tissues of the human body. Epithelial tissue. I'm going to abbreviate tissue. Connective tissue. Muscular tissue. And one other one that we find in the nervous system. We call it nervous tissue. Okay, so of the four basic types of tissue that we will learn about, we will speak and explore epithelial and connective tissues more closely, and briefly just mention a few most important things, here about muscular and nervous tissue. However, muscular tissue will be studied in more detail when we get to the chapter of muscles in a few more weeks. In fact, a couple more months. And nervous tissue, that will be something that will be studied in more detail in SCB 204. But we will mention briefly a few things or a couple of things for each of these type of tissues, just to introduce them before we see them in the future. What we will spend more time with will be epithelial tissues and connective tissues. So let's look at now epithelial tissues, my first category, my first basic type of tissue of the human body. Okay. These are the four basic tissues of the adult human body, or the human body in general. Okay? Why is that? Because there is a early tissue that we have when we are developing as embryos before birth. We'll mention that when we talk about connective tissues soon. So let's start with epithelial tissues. Up to there, everybody follow me? Any questions? Let's start with this first group of tissues. Now, most people, when they think of epithelial tissues, they think of the skin right away. It is one type of epithelial tissue, but we have many others. So how can we define epithelial tissues? We can define this as a type of tissue that covers and lines body surfaces and cavities. Covers and lines body surfaces and cavities. Covers and lines body surfaces and cavities. Also covers and lines organs, and also forms glands. Okay? So covers and lines surfaces of your body, covers and lines organs and surfaces, and also forms glands. Okay, so going by that, one major type of epithelial tissue is the one that covers your skin, right? That's a type of epithelium. But also the mouth, the inside of your mouth. The inside of your mouth is a specific type of epithelium. How about the inside of a stomach wall? When you look at the stomach, the inside of the stomach lining, the lining of the inner stomach would be type of epithelium. How about the surface of an organ, like the surface of the lungs? That's covered by some type of epithelium. Okay? Or the cavities there, for instance, the cavity of your heart, right, which are called the ventricles and atria. Those cavities, let me see, I think I did see a heart here somewhere. But the inner surface of the heart, let me just take this out for a quick moment. And again, can cover and line organs as well. So the covering of the heart here, the covering is some type of epithelium. But also the inner surface, the inner lining here of the heart chambers, which is a cavity, right, which are cavities, are also going to be lined by some type of epithelium. Not a very thick layer, but a thin line in there. And third, also forms the structure of your glands. Your glands are actually made of epithelial cells and tissues. Okay? So therefore, those are many different places where you will find epithelium and not just your skin. Okay? Although we will discuss the skin very briefly today when we look at what classification of epithelial tissues. Okay, but now let's look at some characteristics of epithelial tissues. What makes epithelial tissues different from the rest? So some of the features or characteristics. Some of the features or characteristics of epithelial tissue. First of all, one important thing is that epithelial cells are tightly bound together. Tightly packed together. So when you saw the example that I gave you of a tissue with cells, the cells seem to be separated from each other. But in epithelial tissues, the cells are tightly packed or bound together. See, with very little spaces in between them. Tightly packed cells. Okay? Like the tiles on the floor. The tiles on the floor, just pretend that each tile represents a cell. See how all the cells are tightly packed together, one to the next one, that there's very little space or gap between each other. Okay? And that's kind of very similar to what you'll see with epithelial tissues. Another important thing here about epithelial tissues is that it will have two surfaces. A basal surface, which is attached and bound to some other tissue.
Basal?
Basal surface, right. Basal surface. And up here, a free apical surface. Oops. Apical surface. A basal surface on one side and a free apical surface on the other side. Okay? So one side of the epithelium is bound, right? Lying, bound, or attached to some other tissue. Perhaps connective tissue or muscular tissue, whatever, but it's bound to some other tissue. Bound basal surface. While the other surface that's free is the apical surface. And epithelium will have these two different opposite sides, opposite poles. One surface that's bound, the other that's free, just like the tiles on the floor. Once again, pretending that the tiles are epithelial cells, and that represents an epithelial type of tissue. The surface that's on top, where you walk on, the surface that you see that might have some dust on it, might have some pieces of paper dirty. But that free surface that's on the top that you can touch, that's the apical surface. The basal surface would be the surface below it, that's attached to the floor wood underneath. Okay? So it has two surfaces. One basal surface and one free surface called the apical surface. Okay, a couple of other important things here about epithelial tissues is that also it will be highly mitotic. Highly mitotic. What does that mean, therefore? What would that mean?
A lot of mitosis going on?
Very good. Very rapid, quick, dynamic mitosis. Continuous, very quick multiplication. Why is that? The reason is because we lose lots of epithelial cells every day. We lose them as we scratch, as we bathe, as we dress ourselves. All those dead cells on the surface are shed and lost and are quickly replaced. So very highly mitotic, very, very fast, and intense mitosis going on there in the epithelial tissues to replace the cells that are lost. Okay, in fact, they do believe, scientists have discovered that sweeping up the dust that you clean in your apartments and homes, sweeping that dust, most of it is dead cells. Dead cells either as hair, fingernails that you might cut, right? Or skin, right? When you bathe, when you dress, when you scratch, a lot of that dust, besides pieces of junk as well, pieces of paper, but a lot of that junk much of it is just dead cells that came from your skin.
Yeah.
Now, does it fall off just naturally like that? In some persons it does. It's called dandruff,
Oh.
right? In some persons you can see the skin peeling. But our skin doesn't peel like snakes. Our skin, we have to peel it by exfoliating our skin. How do you exfoliate? When you bathe yourself, whether it's with soap or with a brush or a sponge, when you scratch, there goes a million cells on the floor. When I dress myself, put socks on or whatever, you scratch off and shed off those dead cells on the surface. So yes, a lot of the dust that we collect is mostly dead cells, but still cells at one time were alive. Okay, so that reason why it has to be highly mitotic. And the other important detail here is that epithelial tissues are avascular. Okay, so what does the word vascular mean? Vascular.
Vein, heart. Vein, heart.
Veins, yes, that's part of it. Anybody else? What does vascular mean?
Containing blood or blood vessels.
Containing blood vessels. Good. So epithelial tissue is avascular. It lacks blood vessel supply. You will have blood vessels down here. In the other tissues, right? In the other tissues we'll have blood vessels. But not epithelial tissue. Epithelial will be avascular. It lacks blood vessels. The letter A in science means without. So without vascular, without vascularization, without blood vessels. So now you might wonder, then Professor, how does the epithelial cell get nutrients? How does it get blood flow? How does it get nutrients and oxygen and electrolytes if it doesn't have any blood vessels going into the epithelium? It gets it by diffusion. Diffusion right from the other tissues around it or below it. Things will diffuse like minerals or electrolytes and so forth. Nutrients will diffuse into the epithelial cells. And then it will diffuse in between the epithelial cells as well. So things will diffuse from other tissues like this and between each other as well. But epithelial tissues are actually avascular, without blood vessel supply. Okay. And blood vessel supply is important so that it can provide nutrients, oxygen, electrolytes, and so forth to all your tissues and cells. But because it's avascular, the only way it would get it would be through diffusion from other places. Okay, now we want to classify our epithelial tissues. Up to their questions. We want to classify our epithelial tissues, and there's two important criteria used in classification of epithelial tissues. Two criteria used for classification. one of the criteria used for classification of epithelial tissues is, first of all, the number of cell layers by number of cell layers. Okay? And the other will be by the shape of the cells. By the shape of most of the cells. By the shape of the cells, by the majority of the cell shape. Okay? Okay? So going by that, we will use these two things to classify and identify each type of epithelium. The number of layers that it has, and also the shape of the cells. Okay? Just like we have. You have a first name, but that may not be enough because you may have many persons with your first same name. How many Marys have you met? Many. So how do you identify this Mary from another Mary, or this John from that John, by their last name? Okay? So you have these two criteria, kind of like a first name and a last name. So let's start by, first of all, classifying our epithelia by the number of cell layers. And that we will classify into two groups. So now we're going to classify, first, the simple types of epithelium. Simple means that it has only a single layer of cells. Simple type of epithelium means it only has one single layer of cells. A single layer of cells. So here is an example of a simple epithelium. Let me just draw a few cells. Okay, as you can see, the cells look kind of flat, but only one single layer of cells, right? I'll put the nucleus here. Okay, a single layer of cells is what we refer to as simple. Right? Versus stratified epithelium. Stratified means that it has multiple layers of cells. Right there, that's a stratified epithelium because it doesn't just have one single layer, it has more than one layer of cells. Multiple layers of cells. It could have many more. It could have dozens of layers or even hundreds of layers of cells. Okay? But if it has more than one layer of cells, then we call it stratified. Let's start with the simple first. Now, that's one criteria, again, the number of layers, simple or stratified. But now comes the second criteria, the shape of the cells. So in simple, we will discover that we have three basic shapes. Three basic shapes of cells. The first type of basic shape is the one that you see here that looks like flattened cells, like scales on a fish. Because they look like scales, very flat, like scales on a fish, we call that type of shape of cells, we call it squamous. So here, number of layers, we have simple, and then shape of the cells, we have squamous. Squamous means flattened, like scales. So simple squamous epithelium. Remember, you have to use both criteria when naming and identifying your epithelial tissue. So simple and squamous would look like what I drew there. Simple squamous epithelium. You can put a little drawing here at the end. If you're making a little table like I'm doing, the simple first, simple squamous, and a little drawing here. That looks like this. That should be sufficient for now. Okay? So what is simple squamous epithelium? This is a type of epithelium that consists only of one single layer of squamous flattened cells. Squamous means flat, like you see right here. Like scales. Like the tiles on the floor. Those are flat. Not very thick. Okay? So where do we find this type? These type of cells, for instance, we find it either in capillaries, which are tiny blood vessels, and the alveoli. I'll put here a couple of examples. In fact, capillaries and alveoli. What are capillaries? Capillaries are very tiny, thin microscopic blood vessels. Alveoli. So if I looked at the structure of a capillary, this is taking a capillary out, then cutting it transversely, you would see the capillary. The wall's very thin, made of just squamous cells. A single layer of squamous cells. Again, that's a transverse view of capillary. Very thin, simple structure. Alveoli are those little tiny balloon-shaped sacs that we have in our lungs. Little balloon-shaped sacs in our lungs, which actually play the role of exchanging gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. So if you look at the structure of an alveolus, it also has a simple squamous epithelium. The air comes in this way, oxygen, the air comes out that way, carbon dioxide. That's something that we'll learn about with respiratory system. Okay, but as you can see, very simple, thin structures. Okay, let's move on to the next type of simple epithelium. Simple, and the next shape would be the cuboidal shaped cells. Cuboidal. These have more cube shape. Cube shape. So if I put a simple cuboidal epithelium, it will look more like this. And put some nucleus there as well. Okay, but a single layer of cube-shaped cells. Simple cuboidal epithelium. Okay, so this is going to now change to something else, somewhere else where we do have a simple cuboidal epithelium. An example of simple cuboidal epithelium, we find this in the tubules of your kidneys. The kidneys tubules. Kidney tubules. In your kidneys, deep in the kidneys, you will find these tubules, right? And these tubules, let's say this is a tubule, will be made of simple cuboidal epithelium. Just to put something that represents nucleus, okay? So there's a tubule. You can see that on each side, all around the tubule, you'll have a simple cuboidal epithelium. What's passing through this? The fluid that's passing through it is the fluid that will become urine. But you can see that the wall of the tubules of your kidneys consist of simple cuboidal epithelium. Okay. By the way, these two are not connected. There's a cavity or a pathway in between them. So if we took a transverse section, transverse section like this, we took this from a transverse view, you would actually see something more like this. From a transverse view, you can see that it only consists of one layer of cuboidal cells. Okay? So that would be the kidneys, tubules, and there's a few other places where you have this type of epithelium. Okay, such as lining, the lining of your glands and glands. Okay. Well, let's move on to number 3. The third type of simple epithelium would be simple columnar epithelium. So if I drew that, it would look more like this. The cells look like columns. The cells are tall. right? Tall-like cells, like columns. That's why it's called simple columnar. So a single layer of columnar-shaped cells. Now, where do we find this type of epithelium? We find it, for instance, throughout much of the digestive tract. Throughout much of the digestive tract. So here's some type of tissue, connective tissue, whatever, muscular tissue. But there you would see simple columnar epithelium throughout many parts and much of the digestive tract. Like in the small intestine, you'll see columnar cells. Not only that, but many times these cells will also have what we learned called microvilli to increase absorption. And I believe there's probably better pictures in your book. But anyway, regardless of that, simple columnar epithelium, that is found throughout a lot of your digestive tract. So there is a few examples of places where we can find these three different types of simple types of epithelium with these three varieties of shapes. Okay? Okay, questions about the simple types of epithelium? Questions? Because now we're going to move on to the other types of epithelium that are stratified. Stratified epithelium. So continue with your table. If you have space, you can continue, but I've run out of space, so I'm going to continue here on this side and look at stratified epithelium. Now, the first type of epithelium, again, stratified based on the number of layers, right? And now, we'll continue with the shapes again. Stratified squamous types of epithelium. Now it consists of not just one single layer of squamous cells, but many layers of squamous cells. Many layers of squamous cells. That would be stratified squamous epithelium. Now, we're going to continue here with the stratified squamous epithelium. Those are the types that have many layers of flattened epithelial cells, flattened shape. But they will be divided into two groups, though. First, stratified squamous keratinized type. So here, let me draw something on the side here of stratified squamous epithelium, and you'll see that it has many layers of cells. And it'll take all day to keep drawing this, so I'll just draw one more layer. Okay, but each of these are layers of squamous epithelial cells. But in the keratinized type, in the keratinized subtype, these are types of stratified squamous epithelium that have also lots of dead cells containing keratin. Lots of dead cells here. Lots of layers of dead cells that, as they get closer to the surface, the cells are now just purely, mostly just keratin and dead cells that are flaky, which you shed from your skin. Okay, so where do we find this type? We find it in the epidermis of your skin. Example, epidermis of skin. So, stratified squamous keratinized type is the type of epithelium that will consist of lots of layers of flattened cells and an outer part there, an outer surface there of lots of flaky dead cells filled with something called keratin. Keratin is a protein, a non-digestible protein that you have a lot in your hair and in your nails. But you do have it in your skin too, and your epidermis, the epidermis of the skin to be specific. Not just skin, but specifically epidermis of the skin. Now take a look at your skin, whether it's on your arms, hands, or wherever, and feel it. Feels kind of rough. Feels a little dry. Might even feel wrinkly in some parts. That, what you're feeling, is that type of epithelium. Stratified, squamous, keratinized epithelium. Keratin is that stuff that we shed, that when you bathe, when you scratch, all that dead cells and keratin just comes off. Okay, so the only example here for a place that has this type is in your epidermis. But now we move on to the next type of stratified. The other type of stratified squamous epithelium is the non-keratinized. Non-keratinized. Keratinized. Okay, also lots and lots of layers of cells, flattened cells, right? So here I'm going to draw it. Very quickly, don't want to waste too much time. But what you'll notice is, in a moment, you'll notice it when I finish this drawing up. All the cells, again, many layers of squamous cells, many layers of these flat-shaped cells. And look what I'm doing. All the cells seem to be lively cells. All the cells in all the layers are alive. There is no dead layers of cells. Lively cells. Even the outer layer will consist of lively cells. Okay? So that is non-keratinized. Layers, many layers of squamous cells, lively squamous cells. See all the layers? Here you had dead cells with keratin. Here, they're all lively cells. Okay? What gives you, by the way, what gives it away that they're all lively cells? The presence of what? Nucleus, right? The presence of nucleus means that the cell is probably still alive and healthy, live, and functioning. Okay? Of course, sometimes you'll lose cells there, they will die as they get old, or they will just be ripped off by an accident. But where do we find these type of cells, or this type of epithelium? Example, we find this type of stratified squamous type of epithelium, the non-keratinized type. We find this, for instance, in the cavities. The cavities, right? Like the oral cavity, the throat called the pharynx, the anus and vagina. Okay? Those are just some places where we find this type of epithelium, the stratified squamous non-keratinized. The oral cavity, the mouth, your throat, and those few other places as well. So unlike your skin, this type has many layers of squamous cells, but the cells are all lively and give it a different type of texture, a different type of structure as well. Let's compare. With one of your fingers, or with two fingers from one hand, feel the surface on your skin. You can feel how it feels kind of dry and it, kind of rough. Some places more rougher, like on the bottom of a foot, it's more rougher. However, if you feel your skin, and now compare that to what you feel with the inside of your cheek with your tongue. Now, not with your fingers, because your hands are dirty, but with your tongue. Feel that difference. What is the difference between both? Your mouth, the inside of your cheek, is smoother, wetter, slimy, right? Even warmer than the surface of your skin, which is two different types of epithelium. That's a great comparison. Just feel the skin there, surface, compared now to the inside of your cheek. The inside of your cheek be smooth, wet, slimy, and even warmer, right? The difference when you compare these two different varieties of stratified squamous epithelium. Okay. Now, what about the other stratified epithelium? The other types are much more rare and not found in many places. But they are the stratified cuboidal and the stratified columnar epithelium. Okay? The stratified cuboidal, for instance, would consist not just of one layer of cube-shaped cells, but more than one layer. So as you can see there, more than one layer of cuboidal-shaped cells. Also, stratified columnar would be also similar, except would be more than just one layer of columnar cells. Can be two or even more than that. I made this one too short. Okay? So stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar, that means that you have more than one just simple or single layer of cube-shaped or columnar-shaped cells. Where do we find these two? Not in many places, but one place that we may find these in some of the ducts of certain glands. Glandular ducts. Glandular ducts. Did we say glands already? We did, but we said, for instance, the makeup of a gland. But now the glands have ducts, and those ducts many times will be of this type of epithelium. Simple columnar or simple cuboidal. Okay? Up to there, any questions?
You mean like the ducts?
So we have a
It
gland.
sounds silly, but I just need to have a better picture in my head.
Here's a gland. Here's the duct of the gland. The gland itself has simple cuboidal. Often it will just have simple cuboidal epithelium. That's the nucleus, by the way. While the glandular ducts will have often more than just one layer of glands. That's just one layer, but we put a couple of layers of cuboidal-shaped glands. Okay? So the glands itself, yes, often they will just be simple cuboidal, but while the glandular ducts continue here, if you continue that, will consist of not just one layer, but many times we'll have two layers of cuboidal-shaped cells, or two layers or more of columnar-shaped cells.
In ducts.
Very few places, if any, have this type of epithelium. But if you find them, they probably might be from some glandular duct. Okay, questions about epithelial tissue. So that would be classification. First, your simple types of epithelium, and then your stratified type of epithelium. Now, we do have two varieties that do not fit both criteria. Two varieties that do not fit both criteria at the same time. And which are the two varieties? One of them is called pseudo-stratified epithelium. Pseudo-stratified columnar stratified columnar epithelium. Remember, so far you are used to seeing simple or stratified and then the shape of the cells. Squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. But this one already, you can see that there's a few things missing here. It doesn't say stratified, it says pseudo-stratified. And what is pseudo-stratified? It's a type of epithelium that has something to do with fake or falsely. The word pseudo means falsely. Falsely stratified. Fakely stratified columnar epithelium. Example, let me draw something. And you could very quickly draw something similar. Okay, so there we have a layer of sort of these flattened shapes, of sort of these columnar shaped cells, right? But some of the cells will have the nucleus closer to the surface, others near the bottom, others maybe more to the middle. Because the nuclei are at different levels, some nuclei at the bottom, some more towards the top, some in the middle, it makes it look like it has several layers. Looks like almost it has several layers. But the truth is that it is only really falsely stratified, fakely. That's not really stratified. It's fakely or falsely stratified. It seems that way only because the nuclei are at different positions. Now down here you have some other tissues, right? And one great example where we find pseudostratified columnar epithelium is we find it in much of your respiratory tract. Respiratory tract. Okay? So in much of the respiratory tract, such as the trachea, your bronchioles, your airways, and so forth, will have this type of epithelium. So this is one variation that does not apply the two criteria or the two rules. It's a variation there. Pseudo, meaning falsely stratified, so now it looks falsely stratified. If you look carefully, you can see that each cell touches the bottom there, so there's only really one layer. But truth, it looks stratified because of that reason. Now, the other variety of epithelial tissue would be one that's called transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium. What does the word transitional mean?
To move around?
That it can what?
To move around? Oh.
To change. Very good. To change. The word transition means to change. When you're changing from one position to another, you're in transition. When you're changing station to station, you're in transition at an airport. From one plane to another, you're in transition. Transition means to change. So what is the key word here is transition for transitional epithelium. It means to change. So now what is changing in transitional epithelium? The cells do not have a definite shape. The shape of the cells continuously change. So the cells might look at times round and different irregular shapes. Okay. Sometimes the cells can look more flatter at times. But as you can see, the cells have all varieties of shapes, and that's because the cells are continuously changing its shape. They don't have a definite shape. They're not stratified. I'm sorry, they're not. Yes, it's not really squamous. They're not cuboidal. They're not columnar. They may have many different types of shapes that you'll see that the cells continuously changing like marshmallows that you put in between two graham crackers. Squeeze it, see how it changes shape, let it go, stretches back out. These cells continuously change shape. Therefore, one great example of a place where we find this type of epithelium is in a place where the cells flatten out when it fills with urine, and that's called the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder. That's one great example. In fact, the best example there of this type of epithelium called transitional epithelium. The urethra also. The urethra is that final passageway where urine comes out of your body. What is the urethra? That final passageway that empties urine out of the bladder. The pee of the body. Right? In males longer, in females much shorter. But those two parts there of the urinary system have this type of epithelium. That when urine fills it or urine goes through it, the cells sort of push out and flatten, and then when urine passes and is released, the cells stretch back out again. Transitional epithelium. questions about the different varieties of epithelium? So the normal classification, number of layers and shape of cells. Simple and these 3 types, or stratified and these few types. But then we have these 2 other variations that do not fit the normal criteria. So altogether, you can see we have about 7, 8, about 9 different types of epithelium, with examples that I've given. Okay guys, why don't you take 10-minute break, and when you come back, we'll discuss connective tissues, and then start looking at slides. Take 10 minutes, please. Be back at 10:25. According to my watch, it says 10:15.